Okay.
Majabahiwi, Wawakashikwe, Nindijnakas, Pekwaknagana, Nindonjnaba, Meegan, Nidodim. Today I'd like to talk to you about First Nations people in the institution, the prisons, and how they are coping even. I work for the Parole Board of Canada as an elder for the inmates and for the Parole Board. I advise them on the culture and how it affects what happens with the inmates. So for an example, when a man becomes a firekeeper, how important is that to Native people? Well, for us, it's extremely important. He is the one that starts the sacred fire. He has to learn to do it in the correct way, starting with the tobacco and the prayers that go with it. But not only that, he can't take drugs. He can't drink alcohol. He has to be clean. So by having an inmate that has learned the duties and then is now appointed as a firekeeper for their sweat lodges and their ceremonies they do, it's a big undertaking. And a lot of time, he may have been someone who was an alcoholic or a drug addict. And he now knows that he can't do that. Even when there is no ceremony, that sacred fire is still burning in his heart. So it keeps him from taking drugs or alcohol because that sacred fire, he's carrying it with him all the time, 24/7. And it helps the inmate to become clean and sober, drug-free. If he takes the drugs or takes the alcohol that they make in the institutions that they hide and make, then he is disrespecting his honorable position. The sacred fire won't be sacred. And the other inmates would look on him in a disapproving way and maybe not go to his fire because they know he has taken drugs or alcohol. So it wouldn't be a clean, sacred fire for the upcoming sweat. So part of the work in the institutions is to teach the men their culture. A lot of times they do take drugs and alcohol outside because they're confused, they don't fit in, and they don't know why. Some of them, when they come to the institutions, just realize, I'm Native, because they do a little search for them to find out what their background is. Or they may have been told as a child, yeah, great-grandma was Native. And then that's all that they know. So when they do identify as being Native, they are put into programs specifically for the Native people to help them understand. And they learn their culture. They start going to the sweats. They start smudging every day, but they're learning. The elders in the prisons are teaching them and giving them the teachings. One of the teachings that we have is the 7 grandfather teachings. And each teaching means something important to that person. And the one way of learning your 7 grandfathers teaching is to live it, to live those teachings. And when I'm in the prisons and I'm explaining it to them, I try and relate it to how we live today. So I'll say to them, think of the 7 grandfather teachings as a house. Each one is a different house. But to get to that house, there is a pathway that you must go up. But the pathway is covered in leaves and dirt, so you have to clean that pathway. and you have to keep it clean all the way to the house. And then when you get to the house and you open the door, you find the house is filthy, so you have to clean that house. But you also have to keep the pathway clean. So if you take trust as one of them, you are keeping the pathway of trust clean, which means you're accepting the trust that people are putting into you, that you are going to do what you need to do that day in the correct way. They're trusting you to get it done. And when you open that door of the house of trust, you're now looking at not only the people that are trusting in you, but the trust that you're putting in yourself. And if you don't trust yourself, that's the dirty house, then how can anybody else trust you? So you have to learn to start trusting yourself, and that's the cleaning of the house. And then when you finally realize that, yes, you can trust myself, I can trust myself, that's where the fire inside that house is lit. And you keep that house fire lit by continually trusting yourself. And once you trust yourself, others will trust in you also, because they can see you doing your actions are in an honorable way, in a trustful way, so they'll believe it. Now, I always tell the inmate that you have to live each grandfather teaching for a year, because it may take that long to clean the path and clean the house before the fire is lit. It may take longer. And you start with the one that's the hardest one for you to learn. It may be trust, it may be respect, it may be humble, it may be love. But you work on that for a year. It may take a little longer, but once you've got it, you move on to the second hardest one for you to learn. And as you're learning it, you've still got to keep the first one clean. And it takes 7 years, maybe a little longer, to get all 7 teachings in your body, in your soul, in your mind, and in your heart. And once that 7 years is up, you think, now what? You start over. And you start again with the hardest one to do. It may not be love that you started with the first time. It may be respect for the second time. Because life changes throughout those 7 years. So you yourself will be changing. And you may find it hard to respect people for some reason. So you start with that. And you live it again for 7 years. And for 7 years. And you keep living them. And that's how the Native, it's not an easy life being a Native person, because we live by our 7 grandfather teachings and keeping those teachings clean, those houses clean. One of the other ways that I also work with the Native people in the hearings is that I do walk with a dog. It's my service dog. And she walks beside me and has helped many of the prisoners in the hearings, and also helped the board members themselves. The hearings that we hear, when the questions are asked, they're asked for details. And the inmate must give details of the crime that they've committed. And the one man that stands out the most in my mind, he had been in prison for 48 years. He'll never leave prison. He'll die there. He had killed 5 people of one family, parents, grandparents, and a little girl. But not only had he killed them, he had also raped the women. And the gentleman, the father and the grandfather, saw everything that happened before they were killed. And then he was eventually caught and imprisoned. He's got 5 life sentences that he has to serve. So he'll never get out, and he knows it. He'll die there. But he was so enraged when he came in, and he didn't respect himself or love anybody, or because of the actions that he had done. It was like a devil living within him. And for 48 years, he had been, I can't say a nasty prisoner, but he was very loud. He was rebellious. It took 5 officers to control him most days. He usually stayed within his cell because of his actions. He would fight with other inmates. He was just a very angry person. Now, at 48 years, you think, why is he coming for a parole hearing when he knows he'll never get out? But it's his right to have that parole hearing. It's his right to come and say what he needed to say. So when he came to the hearing, you could hear him coming down the hall. He was that loud and rebellious, and it took 5 officers. He was in shackles. They had the shackle around the waist, around the ankles, and around his wrists. And he was yelling and screaming the whole way down and fighting them. And it's my job when they first get there to go out and speak to the inmate, tell them what's going to happen in the hearing, and tell him that there will be a prayer and a smudge if he wants it. And then what the board members are going to say to him, about questions and stuff. And that it is a circle hearing, so we're all in a circle, but it's not a traditional circle. In a traditional circle, once a question is asked, every person in the circle would speak and answer. Well, that would take too long for all these hearings. So what we have is a conversation circle where the board members, there's 2 board members, and the inmate would speak back and forth to each other. The rest of us in the hearing, in the circle, would listen until the end, and then we would give our teachings. So he understood that, and he was kind of rowdy, always fidgeting while I was talking to him. He was still in his shackles. And I told him that his shackles would be removed, but he would have to be a polite person in that room. And I also told him that there was a 120-pound white dog in there. And she didn't like loud noises. If he made any sudden moves or was too loud, she would probably stand up and stare at him the first time. The second time, I may not have the strength to hold her back if he made any motion toward me in a violent way. Well, that kind of went over his head, telling him all that part of it. All that he heard was that there was a dog in that room. And then he said, could he pet the dog? And I said, yes. At the end of the hearing, if you behave and speak respectfully and quietly and answer all the questions truthfully, then I would let you have 10 minutes petting the dog in the room that's outside there. And he thought about it for a few minutes. You could see the wheels turning in his mind. And he says, you promise I can pet that dog? I said, if you promise to behave. I promise I'll behave. I'll be quiet. So they removed the shackles. Officers didn't want to, but they did it. And I said, okay, the hearing officer will come out and get you when we're ready in there. You promise I can pet that dog? And I said, yes, I promise. Not at the beginning, though, but at the end. Okay. So I left, and when he came in, he could see my big white dog laying beside me. And she was watching him. And he came in and he nodded to everybody and he sat down. They had one officer in the room. They asked if we needed a second one, and I just shook my head, no, one officer is plenty. The other 4 were outside the room, and there was another 5 down the hall, just in case. Well, we did the smudge, we did the prayer, they started their hearing. Now, everybody knew he would never get a parole. He would never get out. But there was some things he told the board members that he had never been able to tell anyone else because they weren't listening. And they talked to him, I guess, a good hour and a half. They gave him suggestions on what programs to take to help him and how to basically behave in the prisons if he wanted to be able to take the programs. They were very respectful to him, and he was respectful back. And then Molly, my dog, she slept the whole time throughout the hearing. She was sleeping, but her one eye was open. She was watching, but she was sleeping. And when it was all over, he looked at me. He shook hands with the board members very respectfully too. And he looked at me and I said, we'll go into the other room while they're finishing up here. We'll go in the other room and you can have 10 minutes with her. And then she's got to come back in here for another hearing. Okay, he was so happy. He got up. He thanked the officer for helping him and for opening the door. We went in the other room, and for 10 minutes he petted and hugged and talked to that dog. And it was then that I found out that he hadn't even seen a dog for 48 years. And when it was all over, they didn't put the shackles back on him to walk down the hall. He promised to behave when they asked him. The other 5 that was standing at the end of the hall, they were dismissed a while back. They couldn't believe how quiet the hall was, that there was nothing coming out of that room and yelling and screaming. And apparently he throws chairs too every once in a while, and there was no noise of that coming out of there because he had been promised he could pet the dog. Well, he left to go to a cell, and he was chatting all the way down the hall with the officers, telling them all about the dog and how she let him pet him and she let him hug her. You know, he was so pleased and quiet. They kept looking back at me as I was going back in the other room with the dog, and they couldn't believe how quiet he was. Well, I was back several weeks later, and one of the officers saw me walking with my dog up to the hearing room. And he stopped me and he says, do you remember that gentleman you had that took 5 of us to bring him? And I said, yes, how's he doing? He says, well, he is the most respectful prisoner in here now. He says, petting that dog and being able to love up on her. He says, he is doing everything possible that the parole board members had suggested to him so that he can take programming. He signed up for programs. He's been going. He's seen the psychologist. He's gone to anger management. And now he's helping the new prisoners coming into the facility how to behave, how to act. He's even stopped a few disagreements and let them sort it out quietly. He says he's a different man. He's turned 180 degrees. He's different. He's in the Aboriginal programming. And he was told if he behaved, he'd be able to go into the Pathway program. And the Pathway program is living the Aboriginal way on the prison grounds. So they have more access to the sacred grounds than the others in the other part of the prison. And he's so looking forward to that. But in the meantime, he's been teaching the younger guys all about their culture. He does speak the language, apparently, so he's been teaching them how to speak their language even. He says they couldn't believe how he had changed from just petting a dog. But the dog has walked beside man since the beginning. In that form, it was wolf, Me'egan. And Me'egan and man were put together by the Creator to name everything on the planet. They were to give names to the animals and the insects and the birds and the plants, the waters. They were to name everything. And when it was done, they would go back to Creator. And when they finished, yes, they went back to Creator. And Creator said that they would no longer walk together, that they would no longer be able to be in each other's presence in a good way, in a healthy way. And I think that's why wolf today avoids man so much. But from wolf, we also got the dog, and the dog walks beside us. And that's one of the reasons Creator separated man from wolf too, was so that dog could walk beside us. And I have a big white dog that walks beside me into the prisons to help the men in their healing. I say miigwech.